Welcome back to another episode of Litigious, the number one podcast in the world dedicated to discussion of stories, legal stories in the news. I'm Scott Peterson. Joanna's here with me today. This podcast is brought to you by Durazio Peterson. We are back after a brief hiatus due to some summer travel, kids home from school, and all the things that cause most of the workplace slowdowns during the month of August. So, thanks for listening. If you like the show, please subscribe, like, and share. This week we'll start off with our in the news topic. If you've been on social media the last couple of weeks, you've probably not been able to avoid clips from the Cardi B civil trial. Cardi B, the hip hop star, was on trial in a civil suit arising out of an alleged assault of a security guard that occurred approximately 7 years ago. So this one really took its time to wheel its way through the system. Why don't you kind of fill us in on what happened? And then we'll talk about why this case was interesting from a trial lawyer perspective in particular.
I can't decide if this is now my number one celebrity trial or if it's still the Gwyneth Paltrow ski trial. Gwyneth Paltrow, I think for me, is always going to be number one just because of how droll she was in her testimony and just how funny the whole situation was. But this was really good too. And her testimony was like perfect to launch 1,000 memes. Her facial expressions were hilarious. She changed her wig every single day of the trial. Just everything about it was amazing. But in terms of the backstory of what was this actually about, she was sued by a security guard, a woman who worked at the medical office where Cardi B went for her OB appointments while she was pregnant, for assault. So apparently they got in some kind of verbal altercation, and the security guard claimed that Cardi B also assaulted her. I don't know that it resulted in any massive injuries. I think I heard it described just as a scratch on the face, but she sued her for $24 million, and it went all the way to trial and was a nice little gift to all of us. And Cardi B was exonerated. The plaintiff lost.
In the plaintiff's defense, when it comes to the $24 million number, this was in Los Angeles County, which has a history of extremely high jury verdicts and cases settling for significant amounts of money when they don't necessarily seem, outside of that city or that area to be worth, that amount of money. I know some lawyers who practice out there, and it's not uncommon to see multi-million-dollar settlements in cases where on the East Coast or probably most of the rest of the country, you would expect something significantly less. Cities tend to have more or higher jury verdicts, big cities in particular. So it's not necessarily surprising, although $24 million is a lot of money for someone who was able to apparently walk in the courtroom pretty easily. And but that's from my perspective. The interesting thing about this is that there's a couple things as a trial lawyer that you see. The first is that this took 7 years to get to trial. One of the biggest complaints, or I should say concerns, that any of our clients have when they get into litigation is how long everything takes. It takes typically 9 to 18 months for a case to make its way through to a resolution. If there's going to be a trial, it can be 2, possibly 3 years. And that's a really long time for someone who's dealing with the behind the scenes issues associated with a lawsuit and the stress associated with a lawsuit. So 7 years is long. I don't think I've ever had a case that went on for 7 years. I've had a couple that went on for probably 4 or 5, but that's a long time to get to trial. So that's the first thing. The second is the importance of witness likability and the importance of cross-examination as a trial lawyer. So first, let's talk about witness likability. You watch the clips of Cardi B, and she was clearly connecting with the jury. And I tell clients at least once a week, I have a conversation with the client about the fact that in the jury trial system, probably the most important thing is whether the plaintiff, and by extension, their attorney or the defendant, can connect with a jury and get a jury to feel that they know, like, and trust them. Because if they feel that way, they are much more likely to rule in your favor. And so, from her perspective, that was a success. And from whatever everything that I saw, she had the jury laughing. Uh, she had the other lawyer, the plaintiff's lawyer, apparently, on their heels. And that goes to kind of the other point, which is that when you're in cross-examination of a witness, the last thing you want to do is give them an opportunity to answer open-ended questions in a way that can connect with the jury. And some of the questions were like asking about her different hairstyles and asking her about her wigs. And at one point the lawyer asked Cardi B to repeat something that she had said to the plaintiff. And it's just, these are the kind of things that, obviously we weren't there. I don't know the context, but typically when you're cross-examining a witness, you don't want to ask any questions that you don't already know the answer to, and you want to ask questions in a way that don't leave the door open for these kinds of answers. So, you know, not you don't want to criticize someone when you weren't there, but at the same time, this obviously didn't work out well because the plaintiff lost. And you know, again, you don't want to be in a situation where a witness is connecting that much with a jury. That's what I see.
Yeah, and I think that happened in the Gwyneth Paltrow trial also, where I'm sure there's a fine line with questioning a celebrity where, these people's job is to be like a showman. And if you give them too much opportunity to endear themselves, then you kind of lose control of what's going on. And I think that's, sometimes people sue these celebrities because they think they have deep pockets, but once they dig in and you're in this trial situation, then I think the upper hand sort of shifts to the celebrity because they know how to work the crowd. And if you kind of lose control of the narrative, I think it can probably go south pretty quickly. But yeah, and I think the jury was out for a very brief period of time before they came back and issued a verdict in her favor. And, the little footnote to this I just want to add is that her Cardi B's lawyer was our friend's sorority sister in college.
Yeah.
But these are the little tidbits that I learned doing this podcast and posting our little work tidbits and stuff. I get people reaching out to me to give me their little personal connection to what's going on, which I appreciate.
Well, that lawyer did a good job. I think you're right. I think people often sue celebrities in situations like this because they figure this person has deep pockets, they'll roll over and pay. She didn't. If it's me, I think my strategy in that situation, if I had were found myself in the position to be cross-examining a celebrity, would be get in, ask as few questions as possible to score a few points, and get them off the stand. Because the last thing you want is for something like this to happen. But I'm sure that's easier said than done. But that would be the way I would approach that kind of situation. So.
And I mean, obviously, this was just a pure credibility determination. I think if it's just when she says, no, I never touched her, and the other person saying, no, yes, you did. And I thought, she probably came off as pretty credible because she is very unfiltered and she is a personality. And she seemed like she was telling the truth because she was admitting things that were probably negative towards her. The other lawyer asked her, did you call this woman fat? And she's like, no, I didn't call her fat. I called her a bitch.
Yeah.
I was like, she seemed like, yeah, like that felt kind of real. So if you don't believe that this happened and somebody's asking $24 million and they're not sitting, as a quadriplegic, which are to me the only people who are entitled to that much money, then, I don't really, I think it's going to be hard to prove something like that.
Yeah, that raises a good point, which is, and somebody who's in the media or the spotlight is probably better at this. When you talk to witnesses and you prepare them, you want them to feel comfortable, sort of being uncomfortable and being honest. And that measure of honesty of saying something that's like sort of against your interest, but also shows that you're being truthful that's priceless because you're exactly right. You want a jury to see you as a real person, not some robot who is just there saying what you were told to say, and that does come through, and that came through here, and I think it did come through in the Paltrow case. It comes through in a lot of the celebrity cases because it's like you said, they're comfortable, or they're just very good actors. I mean, that could be part of it too. So who knows?
Well, yeah, I mean, Gwyneth Paltrow has an Oscar, but yeah, I just, and it's like you said, I mean, there's a fine line because I'm sure that, there's obviously many situations, probably more so when it's just a regular person where your client starts going over the top and you're like cringing on the inside.
I've been there.
Other problem. All right, but I think that's all in the Cardi B case. She's all done. I think she's like making her own memes now and to promote either her album or just in general.
All right. Well, moving on to, I guess, the misleading headline of the week, revisiting this Blake Lively Baldoni case that never seems to stop. Uh, Megyn Kelly, the prodigious podcast host, who is never afraid of a blistering commentary, even when it's inconsistent, maybe with some prior comments, it was the subject of a blistering commentary here because she made a headline when she went on a tirade on her podcast about having been subpoenaed by Blake Lively's folks in the context of the lawsuit, which I suppose is, I don't know, it's not technically accurate. Why don't you explain it?
Yeah, so I think it's just another example of how in today's world, if whether you have a podcast or you have an Instagram account or a YouTube channel or TikTok, whatever, you have to make something out of nothing, right? Because you are putting out content like every day. So, she put out kind of a lot of vitriol towards Blake Lively. I think she called her a narcissist. She called her like a bunch of million names. She said she got served with a subpoena. And it was misleading in the sense that most of the time I would think a layperson, if someone says I was served with a subpoena, they take that to mean like someone came up to me and served a subpoena to me personally for my personal records. And in this situation, my understanding is that not only was it not even her like direct employer or direct company, but it was like multiple steps removed who had been served with this subpoena. So, from her perspective, is that semantics and does it ultimately come down to her? Maybe. But I think the level of, drama and outrage that she sort of worked up over it gave a misleading impression of, what was going on and made it also kind of easy for Blake Lively's people to come out and say, no, we didn't. And that being factually correct statement.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think she's also catching heat because there's speculation that apparently Baldoni's lawyer is the same guy who represented Megyn Kelly in her case against NBC when she got a $25
Oh
million
yeah, and I think
settlement.
he is a frequent guest on her podcast as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if that, I mean, he's like, if he's a celebrity lawyer, it's probably not totally crazy that he would be on somebody's podcast,
Yeah.
whatnot. I mean, I think, and then in terms of the subpoenas, there was a couple other things that were in the news about the subpoenas in this case. Perez Hilton is fighting a subpoena in Nevada that was served on him. The most interesting thing I learned from the Perez Hilton article was his real name.
Yeah. What is he,
His
Italian?
real name is Mario Lavandiera, I think is how you would pronounce that.
Yeah.
I did not know that was his name. Anyway, so he was served a subpoena also. Apparently he lives in Nevada, so he's trying to quash it in federal court in Nevada. It's possible that might get moved to New York, but he's saying that he is shielded by a Nevada law that is intended to protect journalists and their sources. But he's also, saying publicly more in the media as opposed to the context of the lawsuit that he was not paid by anybody or asked by anybody to post anything negative about Blake Lively, and that it was all kind of organic. And I think that is really one of her biggest hurdles in her case, because I think she has two huge hurdles in her case. I think number one is proving this smear campaign in the first place. Because even another thing that was in the news is that, and it was represented in some ways that as a win for her, that or a vindication for her, the judge in the case unsealed a bunch of emails about this smear campaign. And my sense from reading it is that it was the types of emails that were referenced in the original New York Times article that blew this whole thing up. But even those, I think some of the emails even said, oh, they're doing our job for us. We don't even need to implement our strategy because she's getting so much bad press anyway. So I think she's going to have a hard time. And that's what all these subpoenas are out there trying to figure out is, was anybody actually manipulated in some way to perpetuate negative press about her? And then the other question from an employment lawsuit perspective, which is what this is even if they did do that, did they do it because she made a sexual harassment complaint? Or did they do it because by the end of this movie, these people hated each other? Because if it's because by the end of the movie, the people hated each other, unless you have some kind of quasi-contractual cause of action under California law, I'm not aware of anything that you could use in New York. I don't see that that would be illegal.
Yeah, that's the sticky point is under those circumstances, I think that's probably really difficult to prove. Um, you know, it could be based upon anything. To tie it back to that retaliation piece seems like a very challenging hurdle to get over.
Yeah, because that's what the standard is in that type
Yeah.
of case. And then the co-star who played her younger version of her in the movie It Ends With Us, I think her name is Isabella Ferrer, if I'm saying that right, is also fighting off subpoenas, and those are from Baldoni's side. So I think this whole thing, it's a tough thing because I feel like I bring this up every time we talk about this case. As a woman and as somebody who represents victims of harassment and discrimination, you hate to say somebody should not have challenged something or should not have spoken up or should not have filed a lawsuit. But the way this case has been blowing up and how many people have had to be dragged into it in order for her to have probably any ability to try to prove her case is something that I feel like would be a consideration as to whether to move forward or not. Because if you can't prove your case without subpoenaing a million non-parties who are like over the top social media podcast personalities, I mean, then this turns into a big circus, which is what it has become.
Oh yeah, this is a complete nightmare. I mean, you have to, yeah, everywhere you turn, you're subpoenaing people that you probably need or want to have professional, relationships with or good relationships with because you're looking to them for good publicity for other things. So it's,
Yeah, or at the very least, not be, person number one on their hit list of,
yeah,
I need somebody to trash today.
yeah.
So yeah, it's hard because, and I think what makes I struggle with a little bit more in this case is that unless there's some really solid proof that they have behind the scenes that we don't know about yet, that shows that they really did manipulate social media in some way to trash her, I think it's still going to be hard in this context to get away from the retaliation piece of it, not only tying it back to the harassment, but to the fact that the harassment was not of the level that most people are going to be appalled by. Right. So like to have a retaliation employment case, like all you have to have is a good faith belief that somebody might be violating the law. You report it. and then they retaliate against you, and then you're really proving the retaliation. But obviously, any case like that is going to be stronger if the harassment that you complained about is really bad. And a lot of this stuff was, maybe it wasn't appropriate, maybe it was a little uncomfortable, and even if it was sexual harassment within the meaning of the law, ultimately, it's not the type of thing that somebody is like horrified by, that is going to tip like the scale of everything else like in your favor. If you're on the line of, oh, is this retaliation, is this not, the harassment is horrific, you're probably going to be more likely to say, okay, well, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt on this. But if what you're complaining about ends up not being quite as, shocking to people as, some other horrible things that we see in the news, I think that's just going to be another like uphill battle.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. Well, we this one seems like it's not going away. Maybe this will hit the 7-year mark by the time it's all over. We will continue to talk about it as these.
Yeah, well, I think they have, every time they report on this case, they bring up the trial date, because I think we've talked about this before. This like another one of those misleading headlines, like the trial. But while we do talk about a lot of actual celebrity trials, the trial date in this case, I think, is in March, which is in basically, sadly, and not that far away now. I don't really
Yeah.
like the dead of winter, but with all the discovery and all the disputes about the subpoenas and all the stuff that's going on, I'd be kind of surprised if that actually happened.
Yeah, that seems relatively close.
It doesn't seem that far away to hash out all of this stuff. And then I assume that, you know, I would move for some, I mean, I'm a plaintiff's lawyer, and if I were the defendant, I would move for summary judgment in this case on the retaliation causation piece.
Well, maybe my prediction will not be correct that this case would get resolved. I'm still sticking with it, but I could be wrong. Maybe they will go to trial. But we will report back. All right. Anything else on that one?
No, except maybe I should just say, when I said summary judgment, just as a,
Explain what that is.
yeah, just at the end of discovery. So discovery is the process where you exchange documents and you take depositions. When discovery is all over and all of the facts of the case have come out, either side can make what's called a motion for summary judgment, which is basically saying, here's all the facts of this case. When we apply the applicable law to these facts, there's no case. So usually those motions are made by defendants. So you can say, look, even if we take, here's everything that's come out in this case, here's all the proof, we're going to look at it in what's called the light most favorable to the plaintiff. And even if we give them the benefit of every doubt, when we apply the law to those facts, this person has no case to go to trial. So, it's a pretty common thing to happen in a lot of cases, but especially contentious.
Especially in a case where there's such aggressive litigation tactics, it wouldn't be surprising to see it. Okay, so moving on to the non sequitur of the week. The other story that lit the internet on fire was, of course, the Travis Kelce Taylor Swift engagement, and the legal context surrounding that is what?
Should they have a prenup?
Should they have a prenup? Because she is, despite Travis Kelce's ubiquity in podcasting and State Farm commercials and everywhere else, Taylor Swift is reportedly worth 18 times more than he is, which it's pretty incredible. So the question is, should they have a prenup? Now, the caveat to this is we do not handle matrimonial law by design, but knowing what we know about litigation and the way litigation can go when parties have disputes, and also the fact that the divorce rate in the United States is somewhere around 50%, it would seem logical that, in that situation, you might want to think about it, right? Unless you're him. I'd be happy to not have one then.
Yeah, I mean, I think people get hung up on, when you're not in the law, a prenup being maybe an indicator that you don't trust each other, or that somebody's greedy or not greedy, or, whatever. But I don't know. I kind of think about it, I think, a little less passionately, and it seems to me that it makes sense, especially as we get older. And unfortunately, we do see a lot of peers, ending their marriages. So you have a little bit more of a perspective that it is very common, and might make sense to get your ducks in a row ahead of time. Most people probably know that once you get married and you start commingling all your assets in New York, that all kind of goes into one pot of marital property, so that if and when you get divorced, that's kind of all up for grabs. So, I mean, you and I are probably the most commingled as you can get by working together too. But say I had my own job and I made, twice as much money as you, or vice versa. If I'm putting my money into a joint bank account, or I'm helping pay for the house or whatever, that's all considered to be separate property. It's pretty hard to keep that separate in any way. And even when you have separate property, like maybe if I got an inheritance, once I start using my separate property for marital expenses, then that all gets kind of commingled also. And when you're in the marriage, it probably becomes even more awkward to say, oh, I came into an inheritance, I'll be putting that into my own separate property bank account, which you could do, but you might be a little awkward. So yeah, and I think also a lot of celebrities get prenups because, and I don't think either one of them are really connected to or live in California, but New York is not, but like California is a community property state. So if you do not have a prenup and you're together for, I think it's like 10 years, there's an automatic 50-50 split. So if you are some massive earning person and your spouse is not really, now I think a lot of people say, well, that's fair. On the flip side, if the lesser earning spouse is like the wrongdoer or something, it's probably going to be a bitter pill to swallow to give them half. New York is an equitable distribution state where theoretically, if a judge has to get involved because you can't agree, in a mediation or some kind of settlement or something like that, or separation agreement, theoretically the judge is going to kind of figure out what's fair. But in other states, they're just going to split it up. So that would be something, potentially to avoid.
This is also something that people are going to talk about, but no one's actually going to know if it happens because it's private. So it's not something that's typically filed with the court. So I don't.
Yeah, I mean, it comes up when people get divorced
Yeah.
in a state where something like that would be public. So for me personally, I mean, I guess if you live in California, you have no choice. A lot of these celebrities who have ties to other states, they get married in California. Not only is it the community property state, but even if you have a, a prenup, if you get divorced, matrimonial proceedings in California are public. That's why you always read celebrities' dirty laundry when they get involved in a dispute in their divorce, which can also, and then if somebody's like, oh, I didn't really sign a prenup, or I'm challenging the prenup because my spouse is so rich that they forced me to do something that, I didn't really want to do. That's all public. In New York, matrimonial proceedings are sealed pretty much. I mean, at the very least, you can't get them on, electronic filing and things like that. And they're considered to be
I mean, which is
confidential
probably
for the
fair,
most part.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably fair. That's a lot. There's a lot of private information being exchanged. Not only that, but there's typically a lot of allegations. There's always a lot of allegations in litigation, but matrimonial allegations can get very personal. And, not to suggest that anyone's making anything up, but, you would assume that not everything that everyone alleges is always proven out by the facts. But once it's out there in a filing, it's out there. So I think that makes sense. So, good luck, Travis and Taylor. I'm sure they're happy to hear that we've just given them our suggestions as to whether they should get a prenup.
Yeah, well, I mean, why not? Or you could say everything that I have up until we get married is mine.
Yeah, I'd probably take
And
that.
in her case, it would have to be in anything that flows from that.
Well, yeah, that's where the
'Cause
challenge comes in.
that's her like intellectual property. That actually came up with another celebrity thing that blew up because there's no privacy in the world, I think in California was, you know, like Channing Tatum and his wife, they got divorced a few years ago, and I think they had some kind of prenup, but they were involved in litigation for years because she was laying claim to his income from Magic Mike,
Hmm.
but not just, I think it was agreed that, you know, if he did the movie or whatever during the marriage, that she would get a piece of that because it was, you know, California or whatever. But then there was like Magic Mike actual clubs that they opened and all this stuff. And I think she was trying to, you know, and I don't know how it worked out in the end, but like trying to take a claim of that kind of going into perpetuity as sort of being part of the whole thing. So I do feel like for somebody like Taylor Swift, I mean, she's only been with him for a couple years. She has a lot of work under her belt that had nothing to do with him before she ever met him, that is going to pay her forever. So I could see shielding that, even if, you know, even if you shield that, you still have plenty to share.
Plenty, plenty, more than enough.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else for today?
No, I don't think so. Oh, there was another hot tea spilled on someone's groin on an airline case that I saw. The news
Yeah,
loves those. That was Frontier. Spilled a hot tea into man's lap.
I've never flown on Frontier, fortunately. Although they do have some low cost flights out of our area, but somebody should take my advice and get the coffee to be a specific temperature. I don't get it. I don't get it. All right. That we'll leave it there, and we will be back next week, I believe, with some more stories and conversations about legal stories in the news. Thank you for listening. If you are enjoying the podcast, please subscribe, like, and share. Otherwise, any last parting words?
No, I don't know if anyone actually watches this, but I was just gonna say that my dad thought my hat said COX, but it says, which I don't know what he would have thought that meant. But it actually says CQX, which is the airport in China,
All right. Well,
home of the best breakfast in Cape Cod, I would say.
this is true. I agree. All right. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.